Thank you. Yes, Sanjeev, I'm just going to try and give you a little bit of a insight into what's been happening over the last few hours. I have to say that we're not making any predictions. Reuters has not made any predictions yet, but I think at this stage it's fairly safe to say that it looks very, very likely that Britain will be voting to leave the EU. I think we're on about, well, you see, at least you can see it on the board there, we're on about 24 million votes, something like that. Counted. Just over 300 of the 380 districts have declared their results, and Leave is in the lead. Just so you, for context, it depends slightly on the turnout, but the current thinking is that to win, to get a majority, one side or the other will need, I think it's something like 16 million votes, but I think that's on the assumption, I think, of a very high turnout. So it's, that number can move around a little bit. But I think what we can say is that based on the results that we have so far, it's been a better than expected outcome for the Leave campaign pretty much across the board. We saw, I was up early this morning and we saw some of the early results come in from places like Sunderland in the northeast of England. Sunderland was expected to vote for Leave, but voted for Leave to a much greater extent than people had expected, something like 61%. People had probably expected about 55%. Hartlepool, another kind of strong working class area in the north of England, went 70% for Leave. And these are big numbers. And the reason these numbers, the reason this outcome has been so hard to predict, and the reason these numbers matter so much is because, first of all, there is no precedent for this. I mean, the last time Britain had a referendum on this, it was in the early 1970s. So there's really no track record. You can't compare one result to the previous result and say, well, this is a swing in that direction or that direction, which is what happens in a general election. The other thing is that every vote counts. This is not a parliamentary election where you win a seat and then you kind of, that's one notch and then you move on to the next one. The turnout matters, the absolute margin matters. And what we've seen so far is that, generalizing very much, the turnout in the Leave areas has been higher than in the areas that have gone for Remain, and has gone for Leave by a bigger margin than people expected. The one exception to that is London, where we've seen a number of the constituencies in London, Lambeth, Wandsworth, Islington, voting sort of 75% in favor of Remain, which is, again, is probably even more than people expected. But the turnout in London has been a bit lower than people expected, around the mid-60s. It's, as things currently stand, it's very hard to see how this ends up being a Remain vote. It looks pretty solidly like a Leave vote, and that is not what people were expecting this time yesterday. So that has had sort of predictable consequences. I mean, in the financial markets, we've seen really very, very sharp moves. I mean, the sterling against the US dollar started, I think at least the morning in Hong Kong, around the 150 mark. Last time I checked, it was at 135. I mean, these are absolutely massive moves. And really, I mean, when you think about it, not surprising when you have what is essentially a binary outcome, and you know, kind of something goes against the probability in such a way. We've seen, obviously, the sterling futures are down. Shares in HSBC and Standard Chartered, the Hong Kong listed stocks are down 5, 6, 7%. And people are rushing into the safe havens. You know, the yen, I think, was up at 101 something to the dollar when I last checked. There was something coming across the wire about the Japanese having calling a press conference. There's an expectation probably that there will be some kind of intervention, maybe in the yen. Possibly we'll see some more interventions, and then everybody rushing into sort of other safe havens like U.S. Treasuries and so forth. But those are the sort of short-term gyrations, and that's sort of really the markets, you know, trying to sort out what is going on and trying to sort of adjust to this surprise. But I think looking a bit beyond that, just trying to think a little bit beyond some of the sort of the immediate consequences to this. And again, you know, it's early, and we have to sort of see where the results settle. But if this is the result, if it is a sort of 3-4% margin in favor of Leave, then well, first of all, you have massive political turmoil in the UK. I mean, both main political parties were publicly campaigning to stay in. The government more enthusiastically, I think, than the Labour Party, but those, I think, particularly, I mean, the government's position, David Cameron's position, has to be in question, I think, in the medium term, and that matters because what happens now is that you trigger a clause in the EU treaty, in the EU sort of the founding treaties of the EU, whereby Britain now begins the process of leaving, and that's sort of starts a 2-year clock ticking, and that basically means that Britain needs to negotiate the terms of its divorce. And so at this stage, I mean, that is fraught with uncertainty. It means renegotiating all kinds of things, access to the single market, terms and conditions. What kind of conditions are people going to accept in terms of movement of labor? What kind of access is Britain going to kind of try and seek to the single market? What sort of trade-offs are going to have to be made as a result of that? What kind of financial contributions will have to be made? What will be politically acceptable? The first thing is, it's not clear who's actually going to be having those negotiations from the British side. So that's one uncertainty. And the second thing, I think, is that this result, especially, I mean, assuming this is the result, and as things currently stand, it's not really clear what it's a vote for. You could argue it's a vote for less immigration. That seems to be one of the big themes of the campaign. So, which would sort of imply, you know, leaving the European Union, putting up some barriers, kind of restricting the free movement of people, etc. But at the same time, you've also had people say this is an opportunity for Britain to throw off the shackles of Brussels bureaucracy and make its own way in the world and negotiate free trade agreements with other countries and so forth. So there's a real dichotomy there, which is on the one hand you're talking about immigration, on the other hand you're talking about freer trade, and it's really not clear how that's going to be sorted out. I would say that it looks like it will probably be in the EU's interest to make things quite tough for the UK. I mean, that's been made fairly clear during the campaign for a number of reasons. One is just, you know, if one country leaves the EU, especially a large country like the UK, then it emboldens other anti-EU, anti-Euro parties into thinking that they could maybe get a similar result. And so there will be quite a strong incentive, I think, in the EU, in this sort of EU leadership, to make things quite tough for Britain, and to basically say, well, if you're going to leave, these are the consequences. How that quite plays out, I don't know, but I think that's the sort of the starting point, I think, for the negotiations. Obviously has massive implications for London as a financial centre. I mean, Britain operates as a financial centre in Europe partly because of its access to the single market. It has access to, you know, but you can operate from London, you can operate around the whole of the EU through the single passport. It seems to me quite unlikely that that will be able to be retained in its current form. So that means banks thinking about moving people out of London. Where will they go? Will they go to Frankfurt? Will they go to Paris? Will they go to Dublin? Will they go to Amsterdam? There's going to be lots of mayors of lots of European cities flying into London saying, why don't you think about bringing your traders to my wonderful city? And that will be, and I think there will be some consequences for London. And there will obviously be some consequences for you know, foreign investment in the UK. People thinking, well, do I really want to own a water company or an airport or you know, a Mayfair apartment or something like that, if this kind of thing is possible? But more broadly, I mean, I really should wrap this up and let the conversation begin. But I think this is something that we've been talking about and seeing for a while across the world, which is essentially a sort of, you call it a rebellion against the elites. And this is a massive rebellion against the elites, right? This is not just the established political parties in the UK who thought this was a good idea. This is the Bank of England, this is the IMF, this is the leaders of large companies, all of whom saying, really, you know, kind of, guys, this is really important, you should actually stay in. And they have been ignored to a certain extent. I mean, we talked about Sunderland earlier. Sunderland is home to a massive Nissan plant from which they manufacture cars which get exported across the EU. If there is a beneficiary of being in the single market, it is a place like Sunderland. But that does not seem to have been enough to actually persuade people to vote to stay in the EU. One final thought, I guess I would say, I think this is probably the most interesting, well, one of the interesting things about this is that this sort of makes unthinkable things thinkable. So, you know, I think, obviously we know this has been close, but I think there was probably a feeling that people at the end of the day, went in the kind of in the ballot box by themselves, faced with the ballot box by themselves, would think, well, they would vote in favor of their own economic self-interest. They would vote for the status quo rather than the uncertainty of change, you know, that they would probably swing at the end to remaining in the EU. But if, I don't know, if you can have swings like this, if things like this are so unpredictable, then what other unpredictable things could happen? Do you suddenly, does it become more imaginable that we have a President Le Pen in France, or does it become more imaginable that we have a President Trump in the US? So I think it does throw potentially a lot of things up in the air, even if we're not quite 100% sure yet. I think that's the direction of travel.